The grand halls of Eldamore Castle had never felt so suffocating to Crown Prince Alexander as they did that foggy Tuesday morning. The ancient stone walls, which had housed the Blackthorn dynasty for over 8 centuries, seemed to close in around him as he strode purposefully toward the throne room. His polished leather boots echoed against the marble floors, each step reverberating through the corridors like thunder before a storm. Alexander's jaw was set in a hard line, his usually warm brown eyes now cold and calculating. In his hand, he clutched a leather portfolio that contained documents that would change everything. The weight of the evidence felt heavier than the crown jewels themselves, and far more dangerous. Captain Marcus Thornfield, the head of the Royal Guard and Alexander's most trusted confidant, had requested this urgent audience just hours before dawn. Marcus had served the royal family for 23 years, his loyalty as unshakable as the castle's foundation stones. But the words he had spoken to Alexander in the pre-dawn darkness had shattered everything the prince thought he knew about his stepmother, Queen Consort Isabella. The massive oak doors of the throne room groaned as they swung open, revealing the opulent chamber where so many royal decrees had been proclaimed throughout the centuries. Golden tapestries depicting the triumphs of past monarchs adorned the walls, and shafts of pale morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting ethereal patterns across the polished floor. King Edmund Blackthorn sat upon the throne of Eldamore, a magnificent seat carved from a single piece of obsidian and adorned with emeralds the size of robin's eggs. At 62, the king still cut an imposing figure, though the recent years had etched lines of weariness around his steel-gray eyes. Beside him, on a slightly smaller throne, sat Queen Consort Isabella, her raven-black hair perfectly coiffed, and her emerald silk gown arranged with practiced elegance. Isabella Ravencrest had married into the Blackthorn family 5 years ago, following the tragic death of Queen Margaret, Alexander's beloved mother. The marriage had been one of political necessity, uniting the kingdom of Eldamore with the powerful Ravencrest duchy to the north. Isabella had brought wealth, strategic alliances, and an heir of her own, her 17-year-old daughter, Lady Sophia, from her previous marriage to the late Duke of Ravencrest. But as Alexander studied Isabella's perfect composure that morning, he saw something different. Where once he had seen a woman trying to fill an impossible role, he now saw calculated ambition lurking behind her sapphire blue eyes. "Your Majesty, Your Grace," Alexander said, bowing formally to both his father and stepmother. The formality of his address was not lost on anyone present. Gone was the casual "father" he typically used in private audiences. Captain Thornfield entered behind the prince, his scarred face grave and his hand resting unconsciously on the pommel of his sword. At 45, Marcus had seen combat in 3 border wars and had personally saved the king's life on no fewer than 4 occasions. His presence lent weight to whatever revelation was about to unfold. "What brings you both here so early, my son?" King Edmund asked, though something in Alexander's bearing had already put him on guard. The king's political instincts, honed by decades of rule, sensed the gravity of the moment. Alexander exchanged a meaningful glance with Captain Thornfield before stepping forward. "Father, what I'm about to reveal will shock you, but I have irrefutable evidence of treason within our own court. Evidence that strikes at the very heart of our family." Isabella's perfectly painted smile never wavered, but Alexander noticed the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. It was a tell he had learned to recognize during countless court negotiations, though he had never thought to apply that knowledge to his own stepmother. "These are grave accusations, Alexander," Isabella said smoothly, her voice carrying just the right note of concerned surprise. "Surely you're not suggesting—" "I am suggesting nothing, Your Grace," Alexander interrupted, his tone respectfully firm. "I am stating facts, supported by evidence that Captain Thornfield has painstakingly gathered over the past 6 months." The king leaned forward in his throne, his rings catching the light as his hands gripped the armrests. "Speak plainly, my son. What evidence?" Captain Thornfield stepped forward and began to speak, his voice steady and professional despite the magnitude of his revelations. "Your Majesty, it began 6 months ago when I noticed unusual activity in the castle's communication networks, letters being sent through unofficial channels, meetings held in locations that bypassed normal security protocols, and financial irregularities in the household accounts. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle before continuing. Initially, I believed we might be dealing with common corruption or smuggling. However, as my investigation deepened, a far more troubling pattern emerged. Alexander opened his leather portfolio and withdrew a stack of documents. What Captain Thornfield discovered was a systematic attempt to undermine the line of succession, orchestrated from within the royal household itself. The color drained from Isabella's face, though she maintained her composure with remarkable skill. "This is preposterous," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Captain Thornfield, surely you cannot believe such nonsense."
But Marcus Thornfield was not a man to be swayed by royal displeasure. "Your Grace, among the evidence we have uncovered are coded letters between yourself and Lord Aldrich Grimm, the exiled pretender to the throne. Letters discussing the timing of certain opportunities that might arise." The throne room fell deathly silent. Lord Aldrich Grimm was King Edmund's cousin, who had been banished 15 years earlier after attempting to claim the throne through a dubious interpretation of ancient succession laws. His exile had been one of the defining moments of Edmund's early reign. "Furthermore," Thornfield continued, "we have documented evidence of payments made from accounts controlled by your Grace to known associates of Lord Grimm, totaling nearly 50,000 gold sovereigns over the past 3 years. King Edmund's face had gone ashen, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. The implications of what he was hearing were staggering. If true, it meant that the woman he had married, the woman he had welcomed into his family and given access to state secrets, had been working to destroy everything he had spent his life building. "There's more, Father," Alexander said quietly, producing another document from his portfolio. "We have evidence that Isabella has been systematically gathering intelligence on our military capabilities, our diplomatic relationships, and our financial resources. Information that would be invaluable to anyone planning to challenge your rule." Isabella finally broke her composure, rising from her throne with her eyes blazing. "How dare you?" she snarled, "all pretense of innocence abandoned. You self-righteous fool! Do you think you're fit to rule this kingdom? You're weak, just like your father has become." The mask had slipped completely now, revealing the calculating politician beneath the facade of the grieving widow who had found love again. "This kingdom needs strong leadership, not the pathetic sentimentality that has characterized Edmund's later years." King Edmund stared at his wife in horror, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since their marriage. "Isabella, how could you? I loved you. I trusted you with everything." "Love?" Isabella laughed bitterly. "This was never about love, you foolish old man. This was about power, about securing the future of this kingdom under proper leadership. Aldrich understands what needs to be done to make Eldamore great again." Alexander felt a mixture of vindication and profound sadness as he watched his father's world crumble. The king had genuinely cared for Isabella, had seen their marriage as a chance for happiness after years of mourning his first wife. To discover that it had all been an elaborate deception was devastating. "What of Sophia?" Alexander asked quietly. "Does your daughter know of your treachery?" For the first time, genuine emotion flickered across Isabella's face. A moment of maternal protection. "Sophia knows nothing," she said firmly. "She is innocent in all of this." Captain Thornfield stepped forward again. "Your Majesty, there is one more matter. We believe that Queen Consort Isabella may have been planning more direct action against the royal family. We found evidence of communications with individuals known to specialize in permanent solutions to political problems." The implication hung in the air like a sword about to fall. The woman who had shared King Edmund's bed, who had dined at his table and sat beside him during state functions, may have been planning his assassination. "Guards!" King Edmund's voice rang out, though it trembled with emotion. "Arrest the Queen Consort on charges of high treason." As the royal guards moved to apprehend Isabella, she drew herself up to her full height, every inch the proud noblewoman she had always claimed to be. "You may arrest me, but you cannot stop what has already been set in motion. Aldrich's supporters grow stronger every day, and your reign grows weaker.
The kingdom will remember this moment as the beginning of the end for the Blackthorn dynasty. Alexander watched as the woman who had been his stepmother for 5 years was led away in chains. The revelation of her betrayal left him feeling hollow and uncertain. If someone so close to the royal family could harbor such treacherous intentions, who else might be working against them? As the throne room emptied, leaving only the king, the prince, and Captain Thornfield, Edmund slumped in his throne, looking every one of his 62 years. How did I not see it, Alexander? How could I have been so blind? She was very skilled at deception, father, Alexander replied gently, and you wanted to believe in the possibility of happiness again after mother's death. There's no shame in that. But even as he spoke words of comfort to his father, Alexander's mind was already racing ahead to the challenges that lay before them. Isabella's arrest was just the beginning. If she had indeed been coordinating with Aldrich Grimm, then a larger threat loomed over the kingdom. Moreover, there was the delicate matter of Lady Sophia, Isabella's innocent daughter, whose position in the royal household had suddenly become extremely complicated. The prince looked around the ancient throne room, at the portraits of his ancestors who had ruled Eldermore through wars, plagues, and countless challenges. None of them had ever faced betrayal quite like this. Treason from within the royal family itself. As the weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, Alexander knew that the coming days would test every lesson in leadership his father had ever taught him. Outside the castle walls, the kingdom of Eldermore continued its daily rhythm, unaware that the royal family had just discovered a viper in their midst. But within those ancient stone walls, everything had changed forever. The candlelight flickered against the stone walls of the castle's war room, as Prince Alexander spread out maps and documents across the massive oak table. It had been 3 days since Isabella's arrest, and the initial shock was giving way to the grim reality of what her betrayal might mean for the kingdom. Captain Thornfield stood beside him, pointing to various locations marked in red ink, places where Isabella's network of conspirators might be operating. The scope of this conspiracy is far greater than we initially believed, Your Highness, Marcus said, his weathered finger tracing routes between several northern towns. Our investigators have uncovered evidence of meetings in at least 7 different locations across the kingdom, all coordinated through the same coded system we found in Isabella's correspondence. Alexander studied the map with growing concern. Red marks dotted the landscape like a disease spreading through his father's realm. Each mark represented a potential threat, a group of citizens who had been convinced that King Edmund's rule was failing and that change was necessary. What do we know about the nature of these meetings? Alexander asked, his mind working to piece together the full picture of the threat they faced. According to our sources, they begin as seemingly innocent gatherings, merchants discussing trade routes, farmers talking about crop yields, veterans sharing stories from the border wars, Thornfield explained, but they gradually shift into discussions about the kingdom's supposed decline. Under your father's rule, Isabella's agents have been very sophisticated in their approach. The prince nodded grimly. This was not the crude plotting of common rebels, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of sedition. They're building popular support for Aldrich's claim by undermining confidence in father's leadership. It's actually quite brilliant, in a twisted way. Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, the kingdom's master of intelligence, entered the war room carrying a leather satchel filled with additional documents. Geoffrey was a thin, sharp-featured man in his 50s, whose unremarkable appearance made him perfect for gathering information in places where more obvious royal agents would be noticed. Your Highness, Captain Thornfield, Geoffrey said with a slight bow. I bring troubling news from our investigation into Lady Isabella's financial activities. He spread several ledgers across the table, their pages marked with careful annotations in his precise handwriting. The 50,000 gold sovereigns that we initially discovered were merely the tip of the iceberg. Our examination of various accounts associated with the Ravencrest holdings reveals a systematic transfer of funds totaling nearly 200,000 sovereigns over the past 4 years. Alexander felt his stomach drop. 200,000 sovereigns was enough to outfit a small army, bribe dozens of officials, or fund years of covert operations. Where did this money come from originally?
That's where it becomes truly concerning, Your Highness. Geoffrey replied, turning to a page covered in neat columns of figures. Approximately half came from Isabella's legitimate holdings, the inheritance from her first husband and the dowry she brought to her marriage with King Edmund. But the other half appears to have come from foreign sources. Foreign sources? Alexander's voice was sharp with alarm. Specifically, from the kingdom of Velthorn to the west. Geoffrey confirmed. King Roderick has long harbored ambitions regarding our silver mines and our strategic position controlling the mountain passes. If he's funding Aldrich's claim to the throne, it suggests that this conspiracy extends far beyond a simple succession dispute. Captain Thornfield slammed his fist on the table, causing the candles to flicker. By the gods, they're planning to install a puppet king. Aldrich would be beholden to Velthorn for his crown, giving them effective control over our kingdom. The implications were staggering. What had appeared to be a domestic threat was actually an international conspiracy aimed at subverting Eldermore's independence. Alexander felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him as he realized the full scope of what they were facing. What of Isabella herself? Alexander asked. Has she provided any useful information during her interrogation? Geoffrey's expression grew even more serious. That brings me to another troubling development, Your Highness. Lady Isabella claims that she was acting under coercion. She insists that Lord Aldrich threatened harm to her daughter Sophia if she didn't cooperate with his plans. Alexander paused in his study of the documents. The possibility that Isabella had been acting under duress complicated everything. If true, it meant that she might be as much a victim as a perpetrator. But it also raised new questions about Sophia's safety and position within the royal household. Do we believe her claims? Alexander asked. It's difficult to say, Geoffrey replied carefully. The evidence suggests that her involvement with Aldrich began shortly after her marriage to King Edmund, which would support her story of being gradually drawn into the conspiracy through threats. However, some of her actions, particularly the intelligence gathering we discovered, seemed to go beyond what mere coercion would explain. Captain Thornfield crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. In my experience, Your Highness, people who commit treason rarely do so for simple reasons. It's possible that Isabella began as a victim, but became a willing participant as she saw opportunities for advancement. Before Alexander could respond, a knock at the war room door interrupted their discussion. A young page entered and bowed deeply. Your Highness, forgive the interruption, but Lady Sophia requests an audience. She says it concerns information about her mother's activities. Alexander exchanged glances with his advisors. Sophia had been confined to her quarters since Isabella's arrest, as much for her own protection as for security reasons. Her request for an audience suggested that she might have knowledge that could shed light on the conspiracy. Bring her here, Alexander decided, but station guards outside. We cannot be too careful. A few minutes later, Lady Sophia Ravencrest entered the war room, escorted by 2 members of the Royal Guard. At 17, she possessed her mother's striking beauty, but with a gentleness in her green eyes that Isabella had never shown. She wore a simple blue dress, far plainer than her usual court attire, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a modest braid. The change in her appearance reflected the dramatic alteration in her circumstances. Your Highness, Sophia said, curtsying formally. When she rose, Alexander could see that she had been crying, though she was making a valiant effort to maintain her composure. Lady Sophia, Alexander replied gently. Please, sit. I understand you have information that might help us understand your mother's activities. Sophia took the offered chair, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. Your Highness, I want you to know that I had no knowledge of my mother's correspondence with Lord Aldrich, or her plans against the royal family, but there were things I noticed, things that didn't seem important at the time, but now make terrible sense. Please, tell us everything, Alexander encouraged. For the past year, perhaps longer, my mother would disappear from the castle for several hours at a time. When I asked where she had been, she would say she was visiting friends in town or attending to estate matters, but she would return with muddy boots and travel cloaks, as if she had been riding hard across the countryside. Geoffrey leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Did she ever mention specific destinations or companions for these journeys?
Not to me directly, Sophia replied, but I overheard conversations with her personal maid, Martha. They would speak in hushed tones about the northern meetings and Lord A's requirements. At the time, I assumed she was referring to some merchant or estate manager, but now I realize she must have meant Lord Aldrich. Captain Thornfield made a note on his parchment. What about correspondence? Did you notice anything unusual about the letters your mother received or sent? Sophia nodded, her expression troubled. There were letters that came through unofficial channels, messengers who arrived at odd hours and seemed to go out of their way to avoid the regular castle staff. Mother would read these letters privately and then burn them immediately. She said, they contained sensitive estate matters, but the secrecy seemed excessive. Is there anything else you can tell us about these mysterious communications? Alexander asked. There was one incident about 3 months ago, Sophia said, her voice growing quieter. I was walking past Mother's private study when I heard her talking to someone through the window. It was late at night, and she was speaking to a figure in the garden below. I only caught a few words, but she said something about when the time comes and the signal from the north. The room fell silent as the implications of Sophia's testimony sank in. Her account corroborated much of what they had already discovered and provided new details about the conspiracy's operational methods. Lady Sophia, Alexander said carefully, I must ask you a difficult question. Do you believe your mother was acting of her own free will, or do you think she was being coerced? Sophia was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with sadness. I want to believe that she was forced into this, Your Highness. I want to believe that everything I thought I knew about my mother was real, but there were times when I saw an ambition in her eyes that frightened me. She would speak about the natural order of nobility and how the kingdom deserved stronger leadership. I think the truth is that she may have started as a victim but became a willing participant. Alexander felt a surge of sympathy for the young woman before him. Sophia was grappling not only with her mother's betrayal but with the realization that the person she thought she knew had been, at least in part, an illusion. What will happen to me now? Sophia asked, voicing the question that had undoubtedly been weighing on her mind since her mother's arrest. That will be decided by the king, Alexander replied honestly. But I want you to know that we do not hold you responsible for your mother's actions. You are as much a victim of this conspiracy as anyone. As Sophia was escorted back to her quarters, Alexander turned to his advisors with renewed determination. Gentlemen, we have our work cut out for us. This conspiracy is more extensive and more dangerous than we initially believed. Captain Thornfield, I want you to double the guard on the castle and begin systematic searches of all the locations marked on our map. What about Lady Sophia? Geoffrey asked. Her testimony has been helpful, but her presence in the castle remains a complication. For now, she stays, Alexander decided. She's safer here where we can protect her, and she may have additional information that could prove useful. Besides, sending her away now would only fuel rumors about our treatment of the innocent. Captain Thornfield nodded his agreement. And what of Lord Aldrich himself? Do we have any intelligence on his current location or plans? That's our next priority, Alexander replied, studying the map once more. If Isabella's network is as extensive as it appears, then Aldrich may be closer to making his move than we think. We need to find him before he finds us. As the candles burned lower in the war room, Prince Alexander knew that the coming weeks would test everything he had learned about leadership, strategy, and the burdens of royal responsibility. The kingdom his family had protected for 8 centuries was under threat from enemies both within and without. The time for investigation was drawing to a close. Soon, it would be time for action. The pre-dawn mist clung to the battlements of Eldamore Castle like ghostly fingers as Prince Alexander made his way to the highest tower of the fortress. 2 weeks had passed since Isabella's arrest, and the investigation had revealed the true scope of the threat facing the kingdom. Sleep had become elusive for the prince as the weight of impending conflict pressed down upon his shoulders. From his vantage point atop the Raven's Tower, Alexander could see the entire breadth of his father's realm stretching out in the pale morning light. The capital city of Thornhaven bustled with early morning activity below. its cobblestone streets already alive with merchants, craftsmen, and farmers bringing their goods to market. Beyond the city walls, the fertile valleys and rolling hills of Eldermore extended to the horizon, dotted with prosperous villages and well-tended farms. It was a kingdom worth protecting, Alexander reflected, but it was also a kingdom in grave danger. Your Highness. Captain Thornfield's voice came from behind him, accompanied by the sound of armored boots on stone steps. Forgive the early hour, but urgent news has arrived from our scouts in the Northern Territories.
Alexander turned from his contemplation of the landscape to face his most trusted military advisor.
Marcus Thornfield's weathered face bore the grim expression that had become all too familiar in recent days, and the prince's heart sank as he prepared for yet another troubling report. What have they discovered, Captain? Lord Aldrich has been sighted, Your Highness, Thornfield replied, unrolling a detailed map marked with fresh ink. Our agents report a substantial encampment in the Thornwood Forest, approximately 30 miles north of the border. Conservative estimates place his force at nearly 2,000 men, with more arriving daily. Alexander studied the map with growing alarm. The Thornwood Forest was strategically positioned to threaten several major trade routes and could serve as a base for attacks on 3 different northern towns. More concerning still, it was close enough to the capital that a determined force could reach Thornhaven within 2 days of hard riding. What manner of men has he gathered? Alexander asked, though he suspected the answer would be troubling. A mixture, Your Highness, Thornfield replied. Our scouts report seeing displaced soldiers from the border wars, mercenaries from Velthorn, and what appear to be local recruits from the northern counties. The presence of foreign mercenaries confirms our suspicions about King Roderick's involvement in this conspiracy. Before Alexander could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Sir Geoffrey Blackwood and Lord Chancellor William Ashford. Geoffrey carried his usual leather satchel of intelligence reports, while the Chancellor bore the formal scrolls and wax seals that indicated official correspondence had arrived. Your Highness, Chancellor Ashford said with a formal bow, I bring word from King Edmund. His Majesty requests your immediate presence in the council chamber. Representatives from 3 northern counties have arrived with urgent petitions, and there are developments regarding Lady Isabella's interrogation. Alexander nodded gravely. Very well. Captain Thornfield, please continue monitoring the situation in the north and prepare contingency plans for various scenarios. Sir Geoffrey, I want detailed intelligence on Aldrich's supporters within our own borders. We cannot afford to be surprised by internal resistance when external threats are mounting. The council chamber of Eldermore Castle was a magnificent room designed to project the power and authority of the royal family. Tall windows allowed natural light to illuminate the rich tapestries and heraldic banners that adorned the walls, while a massive carved table dominated the center of the space. Around this table, the most powerful nobles and advisors of the realm would gather to discuss matters of state and strategy. As Alexander entered the chamber, he found his father already seated at the head of the table, looking older and more careworn than the prince had ever seen him. The events of recent weeks had taken a visible toll on King Edmund, and Alexander felt a pang of concern for the man who had ruled Eldermore with wisdom and strength for 3 decades. Seated around the table were 3 men whom Alexander recognized as representatives from the northern counties, areas that bordered the Thornwood Forest, and would be among the first to feel the impact of Aldrich's rebellion. Their faces wore expressions of concern and barely controlled fear. Ah, Alexander, King Edmund said as his son took his place at the table. These gentlemen have brought disturbing reports from their lands. Lord Garrett, please share with the prince what you have told me. Lord Garrett of Millhaven was a stout man in his 60s, whose family had served the crown faithfully for generations. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of genuine distress. Your Highness, my lands lie closest to where this pretender Aldrich has made his camp. Already, his agents have been moving through my villages, spreading lies about King Edmund's rule and promising prosperity under their new order. What manner of lies? Alexander asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. They claim that the king has grown weak and indecisive. Lord Garrett replied with obvious reluctance to repeat such accusations. They say that the kingdom's prosperity is declining, that our military strength has been neglected, and that the noble houses have lost confidence in the crown's ability to protect the realm. Lord Marquis of Raven's Hollow, a younger man with prematurely gray hair, leaned forward to add his own account. In my territory, Your Highness, they have focused on economic grievances. They claim that trade agreements with neighboring kingdoms favor wealthy merchants over common farmers, and that taxation policies are driving honest people into poverty. The third representative, Lord Thomas of Ironbridge, nodded grimly. And in my lands, they speak of military concerns. They claim that the border defenses have been weakened, that veteran soldiers have been neglected, and that the kingdom is vulnerable to invasion from hostile neighbors. Alexander listened to these reports with growing understanding of Aldrich's strategy. Rather than simply claiming superior legitimacy, the pretender was systematically undermining confidence in King Edmund's rule by exploiting real concerns that existed in any kingdom. Economic pressures, military challenges, and political tensions were constants in royal governance. But Aldrich's agents were amplifying these normal difficulties into evidence of fundamental failure.
How many of your people seem receptive to these messages? Alexander asked, dreading the answer. Lord Garrett shifted uncomfortably in his chair.
It is difficult to say with certainty, Your Highness. Many remain loyal, of course, but there are those who have been struggling with poor harvests or lost employment who seem willing to listen to promises of better times ahead. The situation is most acute among younger men who lack steady employment, Lord Marcus added. They are drawn to Aldrich's recruiters who offer immediate payment and the promise of adventure and glory. King Edmund spoke for the first time since Alexander's arrival, his voice heavy with concern. It appears that we are facing not just a military rebellion, but a propaganda campaign designed to turn our own subjects against us. This is far more sophisticated than anything Aldrich could have devised on his own. Which brings us to the developments regarding Lady Isabella, Chancellor Ashford said, consulting his notes. During yesterday's interrogation, she revealed additional details about the scope of this conspiracy that are deeply troubling. Alexander leaned forward, his attention fully focused on the Chancellor's words. According to Isabella, King Roderick of Valethorn has not merely provided funding for this rebellion, Ashford continued. He has also supplied military advisors, intelligence specialists, and a detailed strategy for undermining popular support for our rule. This is not a simple succession dispute. It is a carefully planned attempt at conquest through internal subversion. The implications were staggering. If true, it meant that Eldamore was facing a form of warfare that relied not on direct military assault, but on the systematic erosion of the government's legitimacy and popular support. It was a strategy that could succeed even if Aldrich's forces never won a single battle, simply by making effective governance impossible. What else did Isabella reveal? Alexander asked. She claims that there are additional conspirators within our own court, the Chancellor replied gravely. She has provided names of several nobles and officials who she alleges have been compromised through bribery, blackmail, or ideological persuasion. King Edmund slammed his hand on the table, causing the assembled lords to jump. By the gods, how deep does this corruption run? Are we to trust no one? Father, Alexander said gently but firmly, we cannot allow paranoia to paralyze us. We must investigate these allegations carefully, but continue to function as a government. If we begin to suspect everyone, we will accomplish Aldrich's goals for him. The prince speaks wisely, Lord Garrett agreed. If I may speak frankly, Your Majesty, the people of the northern counties are watching to see how the Crown responds to this crisis. Decisive action will inspire confidence, while hesitation or internal strife will only fuel Aldrich's propaganda. Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, who had been silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke up. Your Majesty, Your Highness, I have completed my preliminary investigation into the individuals named by Lady Isabella. While I cannot yet confirm all of her allegations, there are indeed suspicious patterns in the activities of several court officials. He produced a scroll from his satchel and unrolled it on the table. Lord Reginald Blackmore, the Deputy Master of Coin, has been observed meeting privately with known associates of Lord Aldrich. Sir Edmund Grayson, captain of the castle's Western Guard, has been asking unusual questions about defensive preparations and troop deployments. And Lady Catherine Whitmore has been receiving substantial sums of money from undisclosed sources. Alexander felt his heart sink further as he heard these names. These were people he had known for years, individuals who had seemed loyal and trustworthy. The possibility that they had been working against the royal family was both shocking and deeply personal. "What do you recommend, Sir Geoffrey?" King Edmund asked. "A cautious surveillance for now, Your Majesty," the spy master replied. "If we move too quickly against suspected traitors, we risk driving genuine conspirators deeper underground while potentially destroying innocent people based on unconfirmed allegations. Better to watch and gather evidence while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Time is a luxury we may not have," Captain Thornfield interjected. "Every day we delay action gives Aldrich more opportunity to strengthen his position and recruit additional supporters. At some point, we must choose between caution and decisiveness." Alexander looked around the table at the assembled lords and advisors, seeing in their faces the same uncertainty and concern that he felt in his own heart. The kingdom stood at a crossroads, facing threats from without and within that could destroy everything his family had built over 8 centuries of rule. "Father," he said finally, "I request permission to ride north with a small force to assess Aldrich's strength firsthand. We need better intelligence about his capabilities and intentions before we can formulate an effective response." King Edmund's eyes flashed with alarm. "Absolutely not. I will not risk the heir to the throne on such a dangerous mission." "With respect, Your Majesty," Alexander replied, "the heir to the throne will be worthless if there is no throne left to inherit. We cannot defeat this conspiracy from the safety of the castle. We need to take the initiative and show both our enemies and our subjects that the crown is prepared to fight for the kingdom." The room fell silent as father and son locked eyes across the council table. In that moment, Alexander felt the full weight of his royal heritage and his responsibility to the people of Eldermore. Whatever decision was made in this chamber would shape the fate of the kingdom for generations to come. The warhorse beneath Prince Alexander snorted and pawed at the muddy ground as the small reconnaissance party crested the hill overlooking Millhaven village. It had been 3 days since the heated council meeting where Alexander had finally convinced his reluctant father to allow this dangerous mission, and the prince could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down upon him with each mile they traveled north toward Aldrich's encampment. Beside him rode Captain Thornfield, his weathered face set in lines of constant vigilance as he scanned the surrounding countryside for signs of danger. Behind them followed 20 hand-picked members of the Royal Guard, men whose loyalty had been tested in previous conflicts and found unshakable. They wore plain traveling clothes rather than royal livery, hoping to pass as merchants or minor nobles on routine business. "The village appears quiet, Your Highness," Thornfield observed, his trained eye taking in details that would escape a less experienced observer. "But there are fewer people in the fields than I would expect for this time of day, and I see no children playing in the streets." Alexander nodded grimly. The signs of Aldrich's influence were subtle but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. Fear had settled over the northern territories like a suffocating blanket, and the normal rhythms of rural life had been disrupted by uncertainty about the future. "We proceed as planned," Alexander decided. "Captain, take half the men and circle around to observe the village from the eastern approach. I'll take the others and enter from the main road. We meet at the inn in 1 hour to compare observations."
"Your Highness, I must protest again," Thornfield said quietly. "It's too dangerous for you to enter the village without proper protection."
"If Aldrich's agents are present, then we need to know about it," Alexander interrupted firmly. "And the only way to gather reliable intelligence is to see conditions firsthand. A prince who rules from behind castle walls will soon find himself without a kingdom to rule." Thornfield's expression showed he remained unconvinced, but he had served the royal family long enough to recognize when argument was futile. "Very well, Your Highness, but at the first sign of trouble, we retreat immediately. King Edmund will have my head if anything happens to you." As the two groups separated, Alexander led his small party down the muddy road toward Millhaven. The village had once been a prosperous market town, benefiting from its position on the main trade route between the capital and the northern mining territories. But as they approached the outskirts, the prince could see clear signs of economic distress. Several shops stood empty, their windows boarded over, and their signs weathered by seasons of neglect. The few villagers visible on the streets moved quickly and kept their eyes downcast, avoiding contact with strangers. Most telling of all, the usually busy market square was nearly deserted despite the fact that it was a traditional market day. Alexander and his men dismounted at the village inn, a substantial stone building that had served travelers for over a century. The painted sign above the door proclaimed it to be the Golden Stag and depicted the royal coat of arms alongside more traditional tavern imagery. But as they entered the common room, Alexander noticed that someone had deliberately scratched away part of the royal heraldry. The innkeeper, a heavy-set man in his 50s, looked up nervously as the group entered. His eyes quickly took in their well-made clothes and obvious military bearing, and Alexander could see him calculating whether these strangers represented opportunity or danger. "Good day, travelers," the innkeeper said with forced cheerfulness. "What brings you to Millhaven? I'm afraid we don't see many visitors these days." "Business matters," Alexander replied carefully, adopting the manner of a minor merchant. "We've heard there have been changes in this region and wanted to assess the situation for ourselves." The innkeeper's expression grew even more wary. "Changes, you say?" "Well, there's always talk in villages like this. People worry about harvest yields, tax assessments, bandit activity on the roads. Nothing that would concern successful merchants such as yourselves, I'm sure." But even as he spoke these reassuring words, the man's eyes darted nervously toward the stairs leading to the inn's upper floors. Alexander followed his gaze and noticed something that made his blood run cold. Wet boot prints on the wooden steps, far too fresh to have been made by overnight guests. Someone was upstairs listening to their conversation. "Perhaps we could discuss local conditions over a meal," Alexander suggested, his hand moving casually to rest on the pommel of his sword. "We're particularly interested in hearing about recent visitors to the area." Before the innkeeper could respond, the sound of footsteps on the stairs announced the approach of whoever had been eavesdropping on their conversation. Alexander tensed, expecting to face armed men loyal to Aldrich's cause, but instead found himself looking at a young woman of perhaps 20 years. She was dressed in the simple brown wool of a village girl, but her bearing and the intelligence in her dark eyes suggested a background more elevated than her current circumstances would indicate. Most intriguingly, she wore a pendant around her neck that bore the heraldic symbol of House Blackthorn, the royal family's own coat of arms. "Your Highness," she said quietly, executing a perfect court curtsy that confirmed Alexander's suspicion about her true identity. "I am Lady Margaret Stonehaven, and I bring urgent word from the loyal houses of the north." The innkeeper's face went white with shock and fear. "Your Highness?" "By the gods, you're Prince Alexander. I had no idea. That is, I never expected. Please forgive me if I have given offense." Alexander raised a hand to calm the agitated man. "No offense has been taken, Master Innkeeper, but I must ask for your discretion regarding our presence here." "Of course, Your Highness. Of course. But you should know that there are dangerous men about. Agents of the pretender Aldrich have been through the village asking questions, making threats. It's not safe for you to be here." Lady Margaret stepped forward, her expression grave. "The innkeeper speaks truly, Your Highness. Aldrich's influence spreads further and faster than you may realize. But there is hope. Not all the northern houses have abandoned their loyalty to the crown." "Tell me what you know, Lady Margaret," Alexander said, grateful to finally encounter someone who might provide reliable intelligence about the true situation in the north. "My father, Lord Edmund Stonehaven, commands significant holdings 20 miles east of here," she explained. "When Aldrich's agents first appeared in our territory, they made the mistake of approaching him directly with offers of gold and promises of advancement in exchange for supporting the pretender's claim." "And how did your father respond?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the young woman's presence here. "He had them thrown into his dungeons," Lady Margaret replied with satisfaction. "Under interrogation, they revealed details about Aldrich's strategy that I think you must know. Father sent me to find representatives of the crown and share this intelligence." Alexander glanced around the inn's common room, noting that several local patrons had entered during their conversation and were showing obvious interest in their discussion. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private." The innkeeper quickly ushered them into a small private dining room behind the main common area, checking carefully to ensure they would not be overheard. Once they were secure, Lady Margaret continued her account. "According to the prisoners my father interrogated, Aldrich's plan relies heavily on avoiding direct military confrontation with royal forces," she explained. Instead, he intends to seize control of the kingdom through a combination of propaganda, economic disruption, and targeted strikes against key infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure? Alexander asked, his concern growing. Bridges, granaries, tax collection centers, and communication networks, Lady Margaret replied. The goal is to make effective governance impossible while appearing to offer a better alternative. He's also targeting specific individuals, local leaders, merchants, craftsmen, anyone whose support is crucial for maintaining order and prosperity. This intelligence confirmed Alexander's worst fears about the sophistication of Aldrich's strategy. Rather than attempting to defeat the royal army in battle, the pretender was seeking to make the kingdom ungovernable, under legitimate rule. What of military strength? One of Alexander's guards asked. Do we have reliable numbers on Aldrich's forces? The situation is fluid, Lady Margaret admitted. Father's agents report that new recruits arrive daily at the Thornwood camp, but they also note that many are poorly trained and equipped. The core of Aldrich's force appears to be about 500 professional soldiers, likely the Velthorn mercenaries we've heard about, supported by perhaps 1,500 local recruits of varying quality. Alexander felt a mixture of relief and concern at this news. 2,000 men was a substantial force, but not insurmountable if the royal army could bring its full strength to bear. However, the presence of foreign mercenaries confirmed that this rebellion had international backing, which complicated any military response. There's something else, Your Highness, Lady Margaret continued, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. According to the prisoners, Aldrich plans to make his move within the next fortnight. He believes that speed is essential, that he must strike before the crown can fully mobilize its resources. Strike how? Alexander asked, though he dreaded the answer. A coordinated assault on multiple targets simultaneously. While the main force moves against a major northern town to draw royal attention, smaller groups will attack the capital's supply lines, communication networks, and possibly the castle itself. The scope and complexity of this planned offensive was breathtaking. If successful, it could paralyze the kingdom's ability to respond effectively while creating the appearance that Aldrich commanded overwhelming support throughout the realm. Before Alexander could respond to this alarming intelligence, the sound of horses approaching the inn at high speed reached their ears. Captain Thornfield's voice could be heard shouting urgent commands, and the prince immediately recognized the tone that indicated imminent danger. Your Highness, Thornfield called out as he burst into the private dining room. We must leave immediately. A large force of armed riders approaches from the north, at least 50 men, flying banners I don't recognize. Alexander rose quickly from the table, his mind racing through their limited options. How long until they reach the village? Perhaps 10 minutes if they maintain their current pace, Thornfield replied. But Your Highness, there's something else. Several villagers ran toward them when they spotted our group, clearly intending to report our presence. The net was closing around them rapidly. Alexander looked at Lady Margaret, recognizing that her safety was now as much at risk as his own. Lady Margaret, will you accompany us? Your intelligence is too valuable to lose, and I fear you'll be in grave danger if Aldrich's men discover your connection to the loyal houses.
I would be honored, Your Highness, she replied without hesitation.
As they prepared to flee the inn, Alexander felt the weight of the decision he would soon have to make. The intelligence he had gathered confirmed that Aldrich's rebellion was far more dangerous and sophisticated than anyone in the royal court had realized. But it also revealed that the pretender's strategy relied on speed and surprise, advantages that could be countered if the crown acted decisively. The time for gathering information was ending. Soon, Prince Alexander would have to choose between cautious deliberation and bold action, knowing that the fate of his father's kingdom hung in the balance. The great hall of Eldermore Castle had been transformed into a war council chamber, as Prince Alexander stood before the assembled nobles and military commanders of the realm. Banners bearing the heraldic symbols of the kingdom's greatest houses hung from the vaulted ceiling, while detailed maps of the northern territories covered every available surface. The air was thick with tension and the weight of impending conflict. It had been 2 days since Alexander's harrowing escape from Millhaven village, and the intelligence he had gathered there had galvanized the royal court into action. The narrow flight through the countryside, pursued by Aldrich's riders,
had driven home the reality that the pretender's reach extended far beyond his forest encampment. Only swift horses and Captain Thornfield's tactical brilliance had enabled the prince's party to evade capture and return safely to the capital. King Edmund sat upon a temporary throne that had been positioned at the head of the hall, his normally regal bearing marked by the strain of recent events. At 62, the king remained a formidable figure, but the betrayal by Isabella and the growing threat to his realm had visibly aged him. Beside him, Prince Alexander stood ready to present the plan he had spent the past 48 hours developing with his most trusted advisors. "My lords," King Edmund began, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of rule, "we face the gravest threat to our kingdom in a generation. The pretender Aldrich, supported by foreign gold and domestic treachery, seeks to tear down everything our family has built over 8 centuries, but we will not yield to usurpers and traitors." A murmur of approval rippled through the assembled nobles, but Alexander could see the concern in many faces. The threat was real, immediate, and more sophisticated than anything they had previously encountered. "Prince Alexander will now present our strategy for dealing with this crisis," the king continued, gesturing for his son to address the assembly. Alexander stepped forward, his bearing confident despite the enormous responsibility resting on his shoulders. "My lords, our enemy believes he can defeat us through deception and division rather than honest combat. He seeks to undermine your faith in the crown and turn our own subjects against us. But he has made a crucial error. He has underestimated both the loyalty of the noble houses and the resolve of the royal family." Lord Garrett of Millhaven, who had barely escaped his own lands ahead of Aldrich's advancing influence, leaned forward in his seat. "Your Highness, what do you propose? Our northern territories are increasingly unsafe for those loyal to the crown." "We will not abandon the north to usurpers and foreign mercenaries," Alexander replied firmly. "Instead, we will use Aldrich's own strategy against him. While he spreads lies about the crown's weakness, we will demonstrate our strength. While he promises prosperity through rebellion, we will deliver actual prosperity through effective governance." Sir Geoffrey Blackwood consulted his notes before speaking. "Your Highness, our intelligence suggests that Aldrich plans to strike within days. How can we implement such a comprehensive strategy in time to counter his offensive?" Alexander turned to address the spymaster directly. "Sir Geoffrey, speed is indeed essential, but so is precision. We will not attempt to match Aldrich's timeline. Instead, we will disrupt it entirely." He moved to the largest map, pointing to several locations marked with colored pins. "Based on the intelligence gathered during my northern reconnaissance, we know that Aldrich's plan relies on simultaneous attacks against multiple targets. His success depends on our forces being divided and responding reactively to his initiatives." Captain Thornfield, standing at attention near the map table, nodded his understanding. "You propose to strike first, Your Highness?" "Exactly," Alexander confirmed, "but not where Aldrich expects. While he prepares to assault our northern towns and supply lines, we will strike directly at the heart of his operation, the Thornwood Forest encampment." A collective intake of breath greeted this announcement. Several nobles exchanged worried glances, recognizing the boldness and risk of such a strategy. Lord Marquess of Ravenshollow voiced the concern that many were feeling. "Your Highness, a direct assault against a fortified position with 2,000 defenders would require a substantial force. Do we have sufficient troops available for such an operation?" "We do," Alexander replied, "if we are willing to commit fully to this course of action. Lord Chancellor Ashford has prepared writs of conscription for emergency militias from the central and southern counties. Combined with our professional forces and the household guards of loyal nobles, we can field an army of 4,000 men within a week." Chancellor Ashford stepped forward, his arms full of official documents bearing the royal seal. "The legal framework is in place, Your Majesty. We need only your authorization to begin immediate mobilization." But Lord Edmund Blackwood, the king's elderly military advisor, raised a weathered hand in caution. "Your Highness, while I admire the boldness of this strategy, we must consider the broader implications. If we fail in this assault, we will have committed our entire available force to a single battle. Defeat would leave the kingdom defenseless." Alexander had anticipated this objection and was prepared with his response. "Lord Edmund,
You speak wisely about the risks of total commitment. But consider the alternative. If we allow Aldrich to execute his plan unchallenged, he will fragment our forces and pick us apart piece by piece. A coordinated defense against multiple simultaneous attacks would be nearly impossible to sustain. Lady Margaret Stonehaven, who had been granted a place in the War Council due to her valuable intelligence, spoke up from her position near the back of the hall. Your Highness, if I may. The loyal houses of the North would welcome decisive action. My father's agents report that many who have been wavering in their allegiance would rally to the crown if they saw strong leadership and clear purpose. This support from the Northern Territories carried significant weight with the assembled nobles, many of whom had been uncertain about the wisdom of aggressive action. What of the internal threats? Asked Sir Edmund Grayson, his voice carefully neutral. Alexander noted with interest that Grayson was one of the men Sir Geoffrey had identified as potentially compromised. Yet here he was, participating openly in strategic planning. An excellent question, Sir Edmund, Alexander replied, watching the man's reaction carefully. We cannot ignore the possibility of sabotage or betrayal from within our own ranks. That is why this operation will be conducted with strict compartmentalization of information and multiple layers of security. He turned to address the full assembly again. Each of you will receive detailed orders regarding your specific role in the coming campaign, but no one person will have access to the complete operational plan except for His Majesty, myself, and a select group of senior commanders. King Edmund rose from his throne, his voice carrying the finality of royal decree. The strategy Prince Alexander has outlined represents our best hope for ending this rebellion quickly and decisively. But I want every man in this hall to understand the magnitude of what we are undertaking. We are committing the full strength of the realm to a single decisive battle. Victory will preserve our kingdom and our way of life. Defeat will mean the end of the Blackthorn dynasty and the subjugation of Eldermore to foreign influence. The gravity of the king's words settled over the assembly like a heavy cloak. These nobles and commanders understood that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in their kingdom's history, a moment when the choices made would echo through generations. However, the king continued, his voice growing stronger, I have complete confidence in our cause, our strategy, and our people. The rebels may have gold from foreign treasuries, but we have something far more valuable, the loyalty of those who have built this kingdom with their own hands and who will not see it torn down by usurpers and traitors. Lord Garrett stood and bowed deeply. Your Majesty, my house pledges its complete support to this endeavor. The northern counties have suffered under Aldrich's influence long enough. One by one, the other nobles rose to voice their support, creating a chorus of commitment that filled the great hall. Alexander felt a surge of pride and determination as he watched these men and women, many of whom had known him since childhood, place their trust in his leadership and strategy. But even as the War Council reached its conclusion, and the nobles dispersed to begin their preparations, Alexander knew that the greatest challenges lay ahead. Mobilizing 4,000 men was only the beginning. They would need to coordinate movements across hundreds of miles of territory, maintain secrecy in the face of Aldrich's intelligence network, and execute a complex assault against a well-defended position. Moreover, the political implications of this campaign were enormous. Success would establish Alexander as a proven military leader and strengthen the crown's position immeasurably. But failure would not only cost thousands of lives, it would likely mean the end of his family's 800-year reign. As the last of the nobles departed and servants began clearing the maps and documents from the hall, Alexander found himself alone with his father for the first time in weeks. You have chosen a bold path, my son, King Edmund said quietly. I pray to the gods that it proves to be the right one. As do I, father, Alexander replied, but I believe that bold action is preferable to gradual defeat. Aldrich seeks to make us appear weak and indecisive. We will show him, and the kingdom, that the Blackthorn line still knows how to fight for what is ours. The king nodded slowly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Your mother would be proud of the man you have become. She always said that true leadership required the courage to make difficult decisions when the easy path would lead to ruin. As father and son stood together in the now empty Great Hall, both understood that the coming weeks would test everything they believed about duty, honor, and the responsibility of royal power. The rebellion that had begun with Isabella's betrayal was about to reach its climax, and the fate of the kingdom of Eldermore hung in the balance. The final phase of the conflict was about to begin, and Prince Alexander had committed everything to a single desperate gamble that would either save his kingdom or destroy it forever.